Good morning, everybody. How are you doing on this fine day? So this is our last class before your essays are due as a class, and so I'd like to think about Shibagoro, which hopefully you've made your way mostly through, if not all the way through by now. Tomorrow, when you go to your section for discussion, please bring a printout of your Essay 1 thesis. Right? It's a thesis statement. Think about what you'd like to argue and what points you'd like to argue, use to argue that point, what kind of evidence you want to use. So I'm asking for two examples from the life of Shibagoro that demonstrate the changes happening between the Edo Meiji transition. So tomorrow you guys will go over that a bit more in your groups, but I wanted just to remind you to bring that thesis. You work on how to write a thesis, a bit, how to improve that for the essay that's due on Sunday at midnight on Turnitin. And there will be Turnitin instructions online, but it's very simple. You click on a link that's on Moodle that says Turnitin Essay 1, that will say that, and then you will just, when you're done, upload your Word document, and it will be saved for us to take out and grade. Okay? Okay. Last class, we were talking about the arrival of the West, and so I want to just give a little more detail on that because perhaps some of you are interested in that. The West has been on Japan's doorstep, trying to enter very aggressively from about 1790 or so. The British, we discussed, made this sort of disguised attempt to get into Japan that failed. They actually sail around to Edo, the capital, a decade later and try again, but they are again denied. The Russians are also trying, right? They are making their way into Hokkaido. We'll discuss how Hokkaido becomes part of Japan as part of our unit on a class on colonization as a whole. So for now, we'll just leave it at that. They try on Hokkaido and they are turned back. They go to they go to Nagasaki, which is the right place to go, but they are also again denied. They try to attack and to initiate dialogue that way, and they also fail that way. They go to Nagasaki again in 42 and are denied again. The U.S. is perhaps the most persistent. They try 27 times to get to Japan, to be part of, to enter Japan's sort of trade world, and to make that trade open up. One ship, the Morrison merchant ship, brings over some Japanese who are supposed to be shipwrecked, and brings them back and tries to use this as a pretext, right, to open Japan, but they are fired upon with cannons. The first Commodore to go, the U.S. Navy's Commodore James Biddle, he goes to a Japanese ship. He actually forces around the ship and gets knocked down, and so he obviously is unable to make this happen. But as we discussed last class, eventually, in 1953, Japan is aware of the situation in the world. Commodore Perry is able to forcefully displaying his gun ports on his four ships to convince the Japanese to think hard about opening up to trade with the West. And as we discussed, they do eventually capitulate. Excuse me, and they do open up trade with Japan. Japan opens up 8 port cities to trade with the West. The U.S., but also with other Western nations, and under very sort of, disadvantageous terms. So I wanted to now think about the situation in Japan as a whole, as this is all happening. Right? This is happening among some diplomats, among the shogunate in the United States. But I want to sort of take a step back and think about the Japanese who are seeing this happen. The first is the commoners in Japan are immediately affected by the arrival of the West. They don't always see the Westerners. Westerners are confined to treaty ports, but they are impacted by the U.S. Merchants who are able to buy gold very cheaply and sell it for more in China. This is sort of a gold rush, a gold flowing out of Japan problem that leads to the price of gold going up. The government tries to lower the price of gold to control this, but eventually it leads to inflation. So this is a big problem in Japan. Prices on things are going up across the board. To add more to their problems, Japanese different enterprises are having to compete with American products. American cotton in particular, being imported is also just being imported with very low tariffs is leading to a surplus that the Japanese small companies are not able to compete with, so they're being forced to close. And all of these factors lead to more and more inflation. The peasants and the commoner class as a whole is worried about this, what's happening. There are big riots in 1856 in Osaka, which is sort of the capital for commerce and trade at this point in Japan, and in Edo, the country's real capital. And they're worried about the price of silk, which has gone up considerably. They're worried about the price of rice, which obviously is a staple that everyone relies upon. It's also a staple through which people pay their taxes. So to get rice, the amount of rice necessary to pay taxes is more difficult. So all these things make people very worried, very angry, and these riots, sometimes as many as 6,000 people at a time, with sometimes acquiring weapons and sort of building barricades, are quite violent. The government sees the attacks happening against people who are directly handling the money, right? So these are brokers in the rural areas who take the rice and turn it into coin for the government, but also urban merchants. So these are people who people in Japan see as sort of the mean capitalists, if you will, right? But with a little more sort of hindsight, it's clear that they were also worried about the West. This is all the fault of the West. The West came in, drove prices up. They're creating all kinds of problems. They're just sort of as an economic situation bad for Japan, and they also turn the blame on the shogun who allowed these Westerners in the first place to come into Japan. So Japan was not sort of great when Commodore Perry left, and the government was in shambles. The country as a whole was going through a difficult situation. Perhaps the most important figures in terms of politics, though, are the samurai. The samurai class as a whole is impacted by this. And I want to focus on one group of samurai. The book calls them men of talent. It's also considerable as men of high purpose. These are the men who will be in charge of revolution, who will lead Japan to war, who will fight to restore the emperor to power and to depose, or at least to greatly improve and change the shogunate. They are reformers and revolutionaries, so that they're not, artists. They're not protesting. They're activists, right? They're all well-educated samurai, so they are well indoctrinated in Neo-Confucian thought, but also studying other ideas I want to talk about as well. Now, I can't go into this today, but there are sort of three schools of thought that have combined together to inspire many of these men of high purpose. The first we talked about was the school in Mito, right? The school that was calling for reform, for imperial power in Japan, the emperor having power, and calling for the government, the shogunate, to stop overspending, being weak, being unprepared. Another school, which we discussed how this school was tied through personal ties and ideology to the Mito school, is the school of Kokugaku, or the National Studies School, recently sort of being taught and promulgated by Atsutane. The third group, which we didn't discuss in class, but it's in your book, I think, a little bit, is an ideology called Oyome, which is a Chinese, more recent Neo-Confucian line of thinking by a figure named Wang Yangming, who basically says, this is all you have to remember about this, is you cannot really know something if you don't act upon it, right? So knowledge is action. So if you know the right thing to do, but you don't do it, you don't really know it. That essentially is what Oyome is about. This form of Neo-Confucian thought has been taught and has been inspiring the young men who are going to lead the movement to reform Japan. and it sort of goes into the other movements as well. And these together form sort of their ideological framework, how they see Japan and how Japan is going to go forward in the future. There are also men who are ambitious. They would like to move up in the world, and they're frustrated because they can't do that. Antonio. Yes, definitely. Yeah, very much so. So, good question. They're frustrated because they are from domains that are outside of power. We discussed last class briefly that there were those who fought against Tokugawa Ieyasu, right, at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, the one that unified Japan. Those daimyo have been placed far away from the capital, with oftentimes with a lot of money, but not with any power. We also discussed that the Mito domain, also very wealthy and very well-to-do, because they are related to the shogun, and if need be, can be drawn into the line of shogunal succession, are unable to have jobs in the government. So these two groups, men in these groups, more those who are in sort of the middle-ranking samurai and the upper middle class of samurai are frustrated. They can never work in the government, can never have any real political power, and Japan is clearly, right now in a problem, is in turmoil, right? And they can't do anything to stop Japan's descent into chaos. So Mito domain tied to the shogun. These are the three outside domains, or Tozawa domains, whose men of high purpose, right, whose upper middle class samurai are so disgruntled, are dissatisfied. Choshu, Tosa, and Satsuma eventually joins the group. So Tosa here, right, on the Shikoku, far away from on the backside, right, of Japan's hinterland island of Shikoku, and we also discussed Mito, which is up there, and Choshu, which is here, right. And it's no accident that the people who lead Japan's revolution to overturn the shogunate come from these territories. Satsuma originally is trying to work with the shogunate, but they change sides, as we'll see in a little bit. So what do these men of high purpose do? What do these men of talent actually carry out? What do they do? First, they work really hard to communicate with the shogunate. To tell the shogunate, you need to fix all of these holes that are leaking from your boat, right? So you need to bring in technology from the West to allow Japan to be strong enough to fight off the West. You need to have a stronger national defense, right? So you need to pour money and manpower into the coastal defense. You also need to bring people into government who may not be a part of the Fudai or the daimyo who chose the right side of the battle between Tokugawa Ieyasu and the supporters of Hideyoshi's heir, but who are nevertheless men of talent, right, and who will do a better job of ruling than those who perhaps just by inheritance have gained their jobs in the shogunate. And the shogunate actually responds to these, partially because of the ties between Mito, which is the family, right, but also because they see that things are very bad in Japan. And they realize that they need the support of the samurai to continue to exist. They reduce the Sanken Kotai system, alternate attendance, to I think it's 100 days every 3 years, so it's much less. And the daimyo are able to bring their families back to their domains. So the Hist system is relaxed. And they also cut their expenses, and they also think about ways in which they can reform, right? This is a period of reform. They want to try and get back on the horse, so to speak. They also try and promote a policy of unity between the court, which is the imperial court in Kyoto, and the shogunate, right? So let's work together, right? And perhaps, by the end, as we discussed last time, right, this is the policy that inspires the shogun, who at this point is actually from Mito, Yoshinobu, to give power back to the emperor, right, in a big ceremony, and to do this in a very open way, right, because they want to share power and not see themselves effaced. But the Shishi, men of high purpose or talent, they're all about action, right? That's the most important verb, I think, for them is to act, right? So, as you mentioned, Antonio, the ideologies that are inspiring them do lead them also to a lot of violence. It takes time between the arrival of Commodore Perry and the first arrival of Westerners, right? So the Westerners that arrived, they arrived in treaty ports in 58, 59. Yokohama was built, it was sort of a marshy, no man's land. It was built to keep the foreigners outside of, Edo, but give them access to the port. So this is one of several of these ports that's opened, and as soon as it's opened, Shishi, men of high purpose or talent, are trying to find ways to challenge that, right? So they actually go into Yokohama and they attack several Westerners who are arriving as soon as it opens. This is Yokohama when it was opened. If you recall, we discussed how Chief Counselor Ie Naosuke last class, right? How he tried to sort of turn the clock back. Right? He purged all of the reformers in the government. There were executions and there were some imprisonment as well. And he pushed forward the naming of a new young shogun. He signed the treaty with the West anyway, despite the emperor's refusal to agree to this treaty. So they kill him, right? They assassinate him. These are actually loyalists or imperial supporters from Mito and from Satsuma who carry out this assassination. Only 2 years after he purged all of the reformers. Even more complicated, perhaps, in much sort of a larger scale events are also going to happen down the line. In 1863, in 62, a Satsuma daimyo, the daimyo of Satsuma, whose last name is Shimazu, is on horseback. And if you think about the Edo period and how class is structured, whenever a daimyo arrives with a big retinue behind him, right, on horseback, everyone is supposed to dismount and to bow down, right, and to avoid eye contact. As you can imagine, the British don't care about these arcane policies. And one figure, his name was Richardson, refused to get off his horse, right? And so, long story short, this pleased the retinue, the samurai retainers of the daimyo of Satsuma, and they killed him. This is his dead body here. This sets off a war between Satsuma, which is the one domain in Japan, and the British. The British they actually fight a war. It's a short war. It's kind of a draw in the end because no one really wants to go to war. The end result is actually in some ways positive, and the British and Satsuma realized that they could help each other. Right? That Satsuma wants better weapons. They want to be able to protect themselves, and the British are willing to help them with that. So they actually kind of sign an informal truce and stop fighting. But the men behind this, including Saigo Takamori, these are all men of the sort of upper middle level of the samurai class who are in Satsuma, which is outside of power. Somewhat similarly, in 1863, the shogun, the emperor, I should say, is convinced by men of high purpose who've been writing to him and writing him poems and just really petitioning him to act. He issues an edict, and the edict is that the shogun should expel all foreigners, all foreign ships, by the summer of this year. It was very sort of unrealistic, right, as a command, and I think it could only lead to conflict. And perhaps Emperor Kome, who I think he knew this. Obviously, Shogun didn't do this, didn't dream of angering the West or upsetting things even worse than they already were. And Choshu, one of these outside domains, right, sees themselves as the enforcer of the imperial will. Like the emperor says to do this. The emperor is the real power in Japan. Is with the emperor, we're gonna follow through on what he has said. So they fire upon all the ships coming through the Strait of Shimonoseki, which separates Kyushu from Honshu. British ships, French ships, U.S. ships, and Dutch ships. Obviously, these are well-equipped ships that then fire back, and this creates another mini war, a bit of a skirmish. In this case, these different powers have access now to the shogun, and they demand remuneration. They demand an indemnity, and it's actually quite hefty. Yes, Derek. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the shogun clearly is afraid of the West, and that is part of the problem, I suppose. And also, Japan has been able to hold off, every invasion ever attempted, right? So they're very confident, I think, especially that these particularly martial cultures of Choshu and Satsuma, who were very good at fighting, right? And they lost the Battle of Sekigahara against Tokugawa because one of the daimyo whom they were fighting for changed sides, not because they were not as good at fighting as the other soldiers. So anyway, they're very proud of that. And all these movies like the Last Samurai, they're all talking about Satsuma, right? They're all talking about the pride of the warrior class in Satsuma. So yes, these people, I think, don't care as much. They're not as worried about invasion. They're very proud of their ability. But they clearly haven't thought this all the way through. So, a good question. One last thing that the men of high purpose are also doing is, Russ.
Yeah, I was just curious why the West is like more ambitious with their colonial aspirations, like just getting them to open the course. It seems way more aggressive because every other nation.
Like, why not just take over Japan? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Why not just, yeah.
Like they did with China, or
Well, one issue here is that there's no desire to actually live in Japan or in China, really. The desire is to benefit from their commercial position in the world, right? So it's from settler colonization to imperialism, right? To a system in which you can extract more resources if you don't actually go live in the country than you can if you go and invade. So it has a lot to do with that. I see your hand up, Natalie. Yes? Yeah, right. So the sort of specter of the West, right? The image and the shadow of the West is also playing in their favor, or it should, but these people don't actually care very much, which makes things a bit complicated. So the men of high purpose are also teaching and plotting. So they're also sort of intellectually active, and they're planning on what things they can do to accelerate the process. We can't talk about all the men of high purpose, but I want to talk about one in particular. Yoshida showing this figure, so interesting, right? So he was somewhat sort of mid to high ranking samurai class figure. His father and his uncle, his father was an instructor of weapons, I think it was, and his uncle has a school called the Shogason Juku, which is a Confucian private academy. He eventually becomes a teacher at the Han, or the domain school. They were called the system of schools. Maybe we could put that in class. That samurai of the domain who are smart can go to, and from there can perhaps access the Shoheiko, right? The Shogun School Academy in Edo. But he's very interested in the West and in seeing how Japan can change. And he actually stows away on Perry's ship to try and get out of Japan to go see the West. And Perry's men find him and they turn him in. He goes. He's arrested for that. From that point, he's sort of confined to his school. He loses his job at the main school. He's only able to teach at his uncle's school, which becomes his school. But at that school, you have a very radicalized revolutionary thinker. His thoughts, they're not linear. In some ways, he's talking about the West in a positive way, a way that can help Japan. But his main argument is that we need to have imperial loyalism, right? So he's one of the people that sort of crystallizes this combination of the ideology of Atsutane and before him Norinaga, the ideology of the Mito school, Aizawa Yasushi, and the ideology of Oyome. All of these come together in his school, and these are radical ideas, right? They call for action, right? Oyome is about action. Eventually, he's imprisoned and he's executed. Yes, Derek. Yeah, there are actually a few of these people, these men who try and get on ships. There are several of them, and a few actually succeed, but at this point there are none that have succeeded. They're unwelcomed, partially because Perry values much more, right, the Japan opening than having this person go on a field trip. So he's executed, but I want to talk about his ideas a bit that will come up again and again, perhaps in the book and in the future classes. One is that he's part of a movement called the Sonojoi, or to revere the emperor. It's called the barbarian movement. This is about, in theory, about the Western, but it's really about the emperor. It's really about, if the emperor says the foreigners have to go, we should do that. He's from Choshu, right? Paul Choshu thinks of himself as the enforcer of the imperial will, and so he is part of this movement in particular. He also comes to believe, along with a few others, that the way for Japan to succeed in this new globalizing context is to be a stronger country, right? And this is an economic strength and also military strength he's talking about. So this phrase, Fukoku Kyohei, or rich country, strong nation, embody that. And his students, they grab these lessons wholeheartedly, and then his students will actually become the men who, in part, lead the revolution that throws the shogunate, that removes the shogunate from power and replaces them with themselves, samurai who want to make a new Japan. I think the next person is a person sort of I don't think is as important, and his ideology is important because of his role as a unifier, right? So Sakamoto Ryoma is a figure who is from Tosa. You'll recall Tosa is on the backside of Shikoku. There are all these outside forces, outside daimyo. He would like to see the loyalists work together, right? The imperial reformers work together. So he works as a bridge between Choshu and also with Satsuma, trying to convince them to join forces and to support the emperor. And tell me your name? Yeah, that's it. Yeah, right. It makes no sense a little bit, but he has these different ideologies at the same time. I guess what I would say is that he is he's interested in Japan being a modern country and the emperor being in charge of a modern country, and that if it takes Japan being open to the West, he's okay with that, and he wants to use Western tools to achieve that. So that's as sort of linear as we can get with his thinking. Yeah, Johnny.
So is he just like part of the movement, like these barbarians that his ideology doesn't exactly line up with what that whole group of people think? Like he is
yeah.
on a certain level.
There's some diversity in their thoughts. You know, I mean, there are some that hate the Westerners and would attack them if they saw a Westerner, and then there are some like him who are more pragmatic and are trying to find their way forward. So yeah, definitely, it's a bigger movement that the book talks about. So I encourage you to look more on the book at that if you have a chance. So this is all great, but I want you just to recall that for most of the history of the sort of the late Edo period, Choshu and Satsuma are not friends. They're not working together by any at all. There's no unification. Only in 1866, when Sakamoto Ryoma intervenes and encourages leaders from Satsuma to stop fighting for the shogun and to work with Choshu against the shogun, does this union happen. And you read about, well, anyway, I think I have a slide that will help clarify that a bit more later on. So, a long story longer, the men of high purpose are meeting, they're plotting, they're trying to eventually foment revolution, right? And the revolution is about these two figures, the shogun or the emperor. This is Emperor Kome. Sorry, this is actually Emperor Meiji. So Emperor Kome dies in 1867. So a new emperor is crowned, or the new shogun. The shogun who was shogun has passed away, and a new shogun who actually is from Mito, if you recall the family connection, as a cadet line, is Yoshinobu. So these two figures are the two that could be in charge. The shogun has agreed to try and have the court and Bakufu, or the imperial court, and the shogunate work together, has given power back, but they are unable to. These sort of men on high purpose are very. They're very militant, right? So when the shogun actually goes to Edo, to Kyoto, and tries to negotiate the way forward from here, right? And get power back, that's fine. But now, what's the next step? So from Edo to Kyoto, he is refused entry, right? And so this is what essentially starts the war, the Boshin War. So we have the loyalists who are towards the emperor, and we have those who are loyal to the shogun. So the Aizu and initially Satsuma are the two daimyo forces that are working to support the shogunate, and the rest of the Choshu Tosa samurai are the ones trying to create a new imperial army. And they're more and more in touch with the emperor as well. Antonio, I saw your hand up.
What meant that Sakamoto was an anti-modern terrorist?
So he did all kinds of activities to try and harm Westerners, to harm especially one figure who was pro-Westernization named Katsukaishu. He tried to kill him, and then they had a talk, and then he began to have different ideas. So he does change dramatically his way of seeing the world. Sort of in a nutshell, Satsuma and Choshu become allies thanks to Sakamoto Ryoma. Satsuma and Aizu were the enforcers for the Bakufu, but Satsuma, thanks to this intervention of Sakamoto Ryoma, does not help to punish Choshu for some of their misdeeds on behalf of the shogun, and the shogun loses this. And in 1868, these forces now, Satsuma and Choshu and Tosa, officially seize Edo, the palace in Edo, and proclaim the restoration of the emperor. The shogun is abolished as an institution, and also so are the regents. Yoshinobu, who before was sort of hanging on by a thread, is officially disentitled or disenfranchised. And anyway, we discussed this a little before, but this is sort of how the war happens. End of the war, obviously, is one that is in defeat for the shogun. So, the last step in the shogun is the first step of the new government. These new figures proclaim a new Japan with an emperor as supreme authority. And they proclaim a charter oath right away to announce their goals for the new Japan. The new goals are, there are 5 of them, and this is a slide I made, kind of cheesy, not very good, but you get the idea, that Japan will do all of these things under this new government. All the classes are going to be liberated, so no more class distinctions. Of course, that doesn't really happen. That's not reality, but that's what they promised to do. They're going to abolish old evil customs, by which they mean superstition, the oppression of those who have certain points of view, bad things that the West might see as backwards in particular. to unify the classes as well as part of one nation, to have assemblies. Eventually this will result in them having an imperial diet, but this is what they're promising will happen. Seek knowledge throughout the world. Let's focus first on what they actually do first, right? They work on these two in particular, the liberation of classes and seek knowledge first and foremost. The government sends an embassy to the U.S. And Western Europe to see how they do things. It's called the Iwakura Embassy. It lasts for a year and a half. It's half the government. It's about 100 men, including half of the officials who are part of the new government. Many of them came from Choshu and Satsuma. And they're trying to understand how the West is so ahead of Japan. So they go on tours, and they go visit schools and factories, and they visit train stations. They also visit tourism sites to understand how these countries have a national identity that's so strong, or at least seems to be becoming relatively strong in England, the United States, etc. And they bring all this back to Japan and begin to try and build a Japan based on their knowledge from this trip and what they've been reading over the past several years. They also pass laws to change how status functions in Japan, so essentially it's supposed to go away, right? The top knot, which is a sign of samurai status, along with the carrying of swords, is encouraged to be removed in 71. By the time that we get to 76, it's obligatory, as well as the removal of samurai carrying swords. The samurai as a class, they usually have stipends, right, which you learn about in your Shimogoro text. Those are reduced and they're taxed, and then they are next they're regrouped into sort of lower and upper ranks, so just two categories of samurai, and eventually they're totally phased out. And what else? I mean, just all these things impoverish the samurai class unless they're going to work in the new government or in some way to make money in the new system. So that there are only two classes that remain: the heimin, or the commoners, and the aristocracy. The aristocracy is a bit nebulous, but it really is referring to those who are of the super elite samurai class, the daimyo and the daimyo's immediate retainers, and then those who are part of the imperial court. So these are the two groups that are able to have this special peerage, this is using sort of the British system, to be a separate class. The commoners are free to do what they want. They can move around the country, they can work, they can marry, and dress as they'd like. Another big change is the creation of a conscript army. They have this in the U.S., they have this in Germany, they have this in England. This is the way for Japan to become a strong country, right? Is to have a strong army. And the leaders of the army, Omura Basajiro is from Satsuma, Yamagata Aitomo is from Choshu, Hiroko is also from Choshu, and these two are both students of Yoshida Shoin, and they're turning this legacy into more concrete now action by creating Japan's first imperial national military. So they bring all the peasant class is eligible for conscription, and I didn't mention this, but there's also Yamagata also goes twice, spends a year in Prussia to see how their military works. So he uses this to help create a new government. This is not super, well, I guess what I'll say here is that the samurai class loses their swords, loses their stipends, right? Loses their sense of being, right? Like, what are they there for, right? And this is very, very quick. So they are a bit angry about this whole change, those who are not among the few who become officers in the new military. And Satsuma in particular begins to become worried about this new force, but that's not, we'll hold on to that for another time. Commoners are worried about having to be drafted, right, and how this is sort of a blood tax. So this is not being seen by all as riots in these years show as positive things, but it does allow the government of Japan to have a true armed military. I'll also mention education. The Education Act passed while the Korean embassy is still abroad. It's going to telegraph back and say we have to make education compulsory. Now, already the people of Japan are more literate than most other countries, even in Western Europe, at this time. But this is a way that these figures who are on the Korean embassy see for Japan to step up and become a great power. So they create primary schools are created throughout the country, and they're compulsory. And they also create a system of national education. So there's a hierarchy as well there'll be middle schools throughout the country, and there will be a central imperial university, which becomes today's University of Tokyo. And the act says learning is key to success in life, and you cannot afford to neglect it. So I show empty rooms, and then you can see the students sitting in these hand-colored drawings here. The peasants who are trying to work in the fields, not happy about having to go to school. They're having to go to school. They attack these new schoolhouses and burn them down. They riot, but eventually they go along with this. I mentioned this already, so we'll just skip this slide. The other element I didn't mention, but knowledge being taught throughout the world, was to bring Westerners into Japan on purpose, right? So the new government hires lots of foreigners from the U.S., from Western Europe, and also from Canada to come teach, right? To come be educators, to come be physicians, to come demonstrate their knowledge. And these pictures are not really important because they're not named, but they also bring in people who are important perhaps for your education. You might have heard the name William S. Clark, who was president of what used to be UMass before. It was called Massachusetts Agricultural College before. He was president of that. He was brought over to Sapporo in Hokkaido for a year and established that university. Missionary Guido Verbeck also was brought over to be an advisor. All these figures are coming in. Ernst Giles was a German doctor who comes and he creates a new epidemiology movement in Japan as well. Yulia. Yes, up until I think age 11 at this point. Yeah. Sorry. And the samurai class I mentioned before eventually is removed. Countries divided up into prefectures, as opposed to the domains, and the daimyo are taken care of pretty well, but the rest of the samurai class loses all its privileges and has to figure out how to survive in a different way. So, as you're thinking about your essays that are due on Sunday, this PowerPoint in chapter 5 of the textbook are all about the changes happening from the Meiji Restoration, 1876 to 1877. And we discussed last class the years just before that point. So thinking about these things, your essay needs to focus on two of these changes happening in this time of transition that you can illustrate through the life of Shibagoro. Okay? So look over your notes, and tomorrow you guys can discuss that in your sections. Thank you, and I will see you guys next week.